Now, Chris Hart, along with Glenn Silverman from Investment Solutions, have just released their book, Demystifying, the acronym BRICS. Halfway there reveals what they learnt about Brazil, Russia, India and China through trips and on-the-ground research. They conclude that there are red flags and blue sky potential, that the BRICS are halfway there. The title of the book is Halfway There. Well, to discuss, Chris Hart joins us from our studio in Cape Town. Good evening to you, Chris. Before we get into this book, I'd have to ask you for a reaction. Today's current account deficit, a case in point, perhaps because it said that South Africa shouldn't be part of the BRICS. What's your reaction to the figure we saw today?
Well, I think the deficit that we're seeing is a problem. It's become a structural thing, not a cyclical. And it's one of the problems South Africa faces, is that we've had a slowing economy and a widening trade deficit. And that usually goes against each other. Usually a widening trade deficit is associated with a boom. And it does suggest that we are facing some problems of a structural nature. That the slowdown hasn't seen it close is a concern, and that will place pressure on the rand.
This is one of the reasons why we're often considered the poor cousin. We're struggling to increase our exports. But one thing you've found in this book is heartening, that in some spheres, South Africa doing very well. Can you explain?
Yeah, in many measures, if you take things like the World Economic Forum, for instance, the ease of doing business, of the World Bank, even economic freedom, South Africa has actually fared fairly well in the past, but we are slipping in these rankings, and it's a suggestion that we actually need to turn the ship around a little bit, because we do have some natural competitive advantages, and we are a high potential country, but we will lose us. In other words, we've got to hang on to our strengths, and we have to fix our weaknesses. And in some areas, we're in the weakest in the world, and it shouldn't be difficult to actually improve on things like labour relations, education, etc. And they are actually important that we do fix. We do have some natural competitive disadvantages, like the size of our market, for instance, which means that although we're a big fish in Africa, amongst the actual other BRIC nations, we're actually quite a small fish, and that's where the mismatch sort of occurs, is that within Africa there is no really one big country that can actually really take on the BRICS, as it were. But in all of the BRICS, they're not easy places to invest in, and they're not easy places to do business. But to a large extent, investors have been prepared to climb those walls and those hurdles, because there's such a deep potential behind those countries. But South Africa, in a sense, we're trying to emulate China by placing those same barriers, and we should actually be rather emulating Mauritius, which is a small country, understanding their place in the world, and they're trying to become the easiest place to do business. In other words, how do you make water run downhill? And that's what the Mauritians have done. Natural competitive disadvantages. But that's not quite the focus of the book. We try and focus on things. Why, for instance, how does policy get set? And one of the chapters in the analysis of that is the national scars, is that all of the BRICS have some national scars, some multiple scars, and South Africa certainly, with its apartheid past, has a very important scar. And that really dictates how policy is formed and set. Not always optimal in the global context, because these scars are important to the countries specific, where you could say the trauma has occurred, but they're not interesting to outsiders. And so we've got to be very careful of making the national scars an obstacle for people to actually come in and do business.
Chris, let's look at one or two examples. If I can ask you, Chris, to look at India, because I understand that's not looking very good in the book. So can we look at India, maybe that national scar, and how do we compare to India? And then we have to get to Russia later, especially in light of the nuclear deal.
Well, one of the things in India is that when you ask business people what you think the national scar is, they will virtually to a person say it is red tape, bureaucracy, and the corruption that it goes with. And And you can see this with Modi, the president now. He wants to do reforms, but of course, India being a federal system, very difficult inertia within India to actually achieve those reforms. And that's the difficulty that you find. And people find doing business in India can be quite horrendous from that point of view. You take that away, and the experience over the past several years, as they roll back a little bit, the investment follows and goes in as the state allows people to go into sectors and the like. Russia, on the other hand, is really struggling, and its assets look cheap and all that because they don't respect property rights. And property rights is such an important foundation of investing and doing business and confidence in a country. And that's where South Africa has really done quite well in the past. But there are doubts over that in terms of policy direction, and that's because of our national scar of apartheid. That is actually saying, how do we actually deal with it? And so we have to actually be mindful of not damaging ourselves from an investment and business point of view, because that is in fact the source of wealth in the country, and that we need to actually pay heed to that.
Chris, should we be doing business with Russia? This has obviously come up in light of the nuclear framework agreement. It looks like there still will be a procurement process, but Russia in line to supply us with nuclear power plants. Is that even an advantage for Russia?
Well, there's first a number of questions. The nuclear was specifically rejected in the National Development Plan, which is supposed to be our policy. So one wonders how nuclear is getting onto the agenda in the first place. The second thing is, even if it was economically feasible to do so, one has to ask the question, is the bidding process open and transparent and competitive? And if it fulfills those criteria, and Russia in a global context beats other players in this particular field, it can actually be a good deal for South Africa. But it must be in an open, transparent and competitive bidding process. If it's done a secret deal, favours, etc., through the back door, then even if it's a bargain for South Africa, it is not a good deal.
Chris, there's one argument that investment goes where it's logical. There's another argument that maybe if you form these relationships at a government level and business people go with the president, say to Russia, India or China, it opens up opportunities. What we're looking at with this deal, is that a case in point, that it does open opportunities?
Well, it depends on whether you're actually using these trips as a relationship-building exercise, and you still are doing deals that make commercial sense. No problem. But if you've got, for instance, the elephant in the room, we are going to do nuclear. Come along with us and see how you can actually support the decision that has been made in principle. You create what I call as dead capital. In other words, you're investing in projects where you don't actually get a sufficient or adequate return, because this is what we call financial repression, where you're actually channeling capital to areas there where it wouldn't go naturally. And by dead capital, I mean you invest in a project and there's no return on it. And so where do you get resources for the next project? And South Africa's got too many dead capital projects. The World Cup Stadium come to mind. 35 billion for Medupi, I think, is an excellent price, but not 135 billion. That additional cost overruns is in fact what I call dead capital, because it's things that could have done something else in the economy, but you couldn't do that in the economy. No, sorry.
No problem, Chris.
You can do it because you've actually channeled that capital to those inefficiencies.
Chris, while you have a quick cough, and we've basically run out of time, so in a few seconds, I just want you to tell me, you went and you visited, touched, tasted, smelt these countries, you went on the ground. Quickly, any big surprises, and who has the best food?
India undoubtedly has very, very good food, but Brazil does very well as well. South Africa does well.
All right,
but I think it's very, depending on price, Moscow as well. So you can do very well if you've got the money.
All right, thank you very much. Struggling a bit there. Great to chat as always. That was Chris Hart, co-author of Halfway There, which has just been launched. A quick look at the markets now. Pro-democracy protest taking place in Hong Kong, keeping investors on edge today, and the JSE ending lower, but only just. The all-share index fell by a very small fraction. ArcelorMittal adding nearly 3% after plunging yesterday. Telkom rose by more than 3%. Platinum miners rose, which makes for a change from the general trend that we've been seeing. Amplats fell, but Impala and Lonmin adding more than 2% each. And after falling to 11.32 to the dollar, the rand recovering a little, still trading around those 8-month lows after the release of that trade data today.